Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sheila Crane, and I am the chair of the Architectural History Department here in the School of Architecture at UVA. And it really is a singular honor this afternoon to welcome Brent Leggs to the School of Architecture and to the University of Virginia to deliver the 2021 Hanbury Endowed Lecture in Historic Preservation. And I should also remind everyone that this evening's talk is hosted in collaboration with the Center for Cultural Landscapes, and we're thrilled to be able to join in partnership with them this evening. Brent Leggs is Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, an initiative of the National Trust for Historic Preservation that was first launched in 2017. Envisioned as a social movement for justice, equity, and reconciliation, the Action Fund promotes the role of cultural preservation in telling the nation's full history and empowers activists, entrepreneurs, artists, and civic leaders to advocate on behalf of African American historic places. Under Brent Leggs' directorship, the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund has been leading a national conversation about preservation's potential as a path for equity, confronting head-on the important task of redressing and dismantling the structural racism and inequity embedded in the history of preservation, as in the history of all of our disciplines, while recognizing, as Leggs himself has observed, quote, the power of preservation as an effective tool for sustainable and equitable revitalization. So Brent Leggs' work with the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund has followed on nearly 2 decades of groundbreaking work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the sites that have been stewarded through his leadership are really too many to cite here. But range from historically Black universities, including Tuskegee and Morgan State universities, to the Langston Hughes House in Harlem, the John and Alice Coltrane Home in Dix Hills, New York, and Joe Frazier's Gym in Philadelphia, to name only a few. Along with Carrie Rubin and Bird Wood, Brent Leggs is the author of Preserving African American Historic Places, published in 2012, as part of the series Preservation Books that were published by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The first such publication to bring together varied strategies and case studies focused specifically on preserving and honoring historic places and cultural landscapes associated with African American history. The book was quickly reprinted 2 years later in 2014. In addition to his work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Brent Leggs has taught courses in preservation and cultural heritage at a wide range of institutions, including Boston Architectural College, the University of Maryland, and Columbia University. He currently holds an appointment as Adjunct Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is teaching a studio and serving as Senior Advisor to the Center for Preserving Civil Rights Sites. His work has garnered national and international attention and accolades, including the 2018 Robert G. Stanton National Preservation Award and a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard University. In addition to his innumerable lectures, keynotes, technical reports, and his service on a really astounding range of advisory committees, Leggs' published work includes Success Leaves Footprints, Preserving Rosenwald Schools, which is forthcoming in April in Andrew Feller's book on Rosenwald Schools, which will be published by the University of Georgia Press. Other essays have appeared in Preservation and Social Inclusion, published by Columbia Books on Architecture in the City in 2020, and in State of Black Museums, published by the University of California Press in 2018. This evening, his talk is entitled Building a True National Identity. So please join me in offering a warm, if virtual, welcome to Brent Leggs.
Thank you, Sheila, for that introduction. And I feel that I should mail you $100 for being so kind and complimentary and telling my story. So I'm going to upload, share my screen. So welcome everyone. I am delighted to spend time with you today talking about our collective work to build a true national identity that reflects America's true diversity. So what I thought I would do is first start out by talking about the why. We all have why moments in our lives that has connected us to historic built environments and landscapes, or has inspired us to be part of this work to leverage the power of design in place in cities and urban rural environments. But my first memory of race, place, and identity was when I was in the 3rd grade. So I'm from a little town in Western Kentucky called Paducah, Kentucky. And my mom, as this professional development exercise, invited me and my twin brother, when we were going to register for school, to walk up to the administrator's desk to introduce ourselves and to lead the enrollment process. And so I did that. I said, my name is Brent Leggs. She said, what's your address? And I said, 741 McGuire Avenue. And she said, what apartment number? And I said, 741. And she said, no, what apartment number? And I said, 741. And I'm looking up at my mom, getting confused at that moment. And I noticed that my mother is getting agitated. And my mom only got agitated with her kids and not other adults. I knew something wasn't right. And I would learn that day that that was the first experience that I can remember that's connected to racial and implicit bias. Because we lived on this long street, McGuire Avenue. My parents in 1972 constructed their own house that they were very proud of. It was a brick red ranch style home that we grew up in. And at the far end of McGuire Avenue was low income housing that has an apartment number. Fast forward years later, you know, my family, we didn't sit around the dinner table and talk about the power of 4F to protect historic places or Section 106, or had no idea that preservation could be a potential career for me. But as I look back, preservation was happening on an informal basis. So if you've ever been in a Black church and the preacher asks for the 2nd or 3rd offering to raise money to be able to create a building fund for the church. And at my church, Macedonia Historic Baptist Church, I remember that 3rd offering and the need to raise money to replace the roof on the historic church building. Well, every year in September, when we had our family reunion in Central Kentucky, and part of the joy wasn't just connecting with family from all across the country, it was that we would go to the family cemetery and that we would mow the grass and we would clean the headstones as a way to honor our ancestors and family members. And in essence, that was a form of cultural conservation, just on an informal basis. Fast forward years later, I would go to the University of Kentucky. I would get a master's in business, thinking that I was going to go to New York and seize corporate America and make a lot of money. And started realizing that that didn't fit my personality. So I started the process of soul searching. And I thought, I'm gonna get a PhD in history, I'm gonna get a PhD in philosophy. And once I realized you needed to speak fluently in a second language, I forgot about philosophy. And then I thought I discovered it, which was a furniture making program in the School of Architecture at UK. And I walk inside the building and I have this random, unexpected, unintentional conversation with Dr. Dennis Domer, who was the chair of the graduate program in historic preservation. He told me I'd be the first African-American to enter the program, first person with an MBA. You can imagine at the time, this was in the early 2000s, that the historic redevelopment loft conversion was hot and on trend. And he said, I could make a shitload of money using federal tax credits. That piqued my interest. And then when he said that I would be awarded the highest scholarship, the Lyman T. Johnson, I was sold. And 2 months later, I was learning about architectural history and iconic columns and questioning whether or not I made the right decision. But thankfully, I was asked as part of my research assistantship to conduct a statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. This is an example of this beautiful archetype. So Booker T. Washington was already iconic for me. I had read Up From Slavery, his autobiography, and I think anyone who reads that will be inspired that a man formerly enslaved would found an institution known as Tuskegee Institute at the time in Alabama. That is a remarkable accomplishment in itself. But when I learned that he collaborated with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the second president of Sears and Roebuck, and together they would help to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states, that these schools stand as a physical manifestation of their social movement in response to a crisis in Black education, that these schools stand as testimony that African American children deserve to be educated in the most architecturally advanced school buildings at the time. I learned that America's first African American architect, Robert Taylor, first Black graduate of MIT, was the initial designer for the school plans. I learned that George Washington Carver was the landscape designer. And I remember the first building that I discovered. It was being held up by a tree. It was a one-room school like this. And so I walk in the inside. You can imagine the backside totally open. I mean, it was decaying back into the landscape. And all I could think was, I hope there's no snakes inside this building as I began to tour this abandoned history. But I noticed that I could hear the floorboards creak. I noticed the fenestration of the windows was on my right side, and I remember seeing the sunlight shining through broken window panes. And I could smell decay. And I walk out on the other side, and it felt like I had just, kind of entered a different universe. And I started to understand the quiet power of preservation, to bring the past and the present, to remove the gap between space and time, and to bring the past and present together unlike any other form of history. And so I started to learn that preservation wasn't just multi-sensory, that it also was transcendent and spiritual. And what I mean by that is Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my life because of my parents attending Rosenwald schools. That for me was power. I had a personal and professional connection to this work, and I started to ask myself, what is my social responsibility to continue the legacy work of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald? How can I leverage my talents to uplift and to build a more just and equitable society? Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, because of historic preservation, their remarkable lives once lived are real. So I'm sure you've heard of a cultural icon known as Beyonce. Now, I love this quote, and this was part of her visual album called Lemonade. And the sentence goes, "The past and the future merge to meet us here." And I want you to keep this in your mind. The past and the future merge to meet us here. White America has enslaved Black Americans for 250 years, creating a social disease that stains all aspects of American society. We in this moment continue to fight these legacies. Fighting cultural inequity. So I'm sure many of you know that in 1853, Anne Pamela Cunningham created an organization called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And in essence, their advocacy and community organizing would birth the US preservation movement. And they were able to save the home of President George Washington. This also began the long, slow process of creating inequity in the way that we define what is worthy of preservation and the way that we record it in our national inventory, the way that we direct investment to tell the full American story. The inequity is that today, only 2% of African American historic places are reflected in our national inventory, the National Register of Historic Places, which has an inventory of nearly 100,000 places. The majority of those stories and assets tells the story of white men of privilege, the presidents, the business leaders, the plantation owners, and only 10% and less reflects America's true diversity. Black American history, Latino American history, Native American, Asian American, LGBTQ, and women's history. We continue to fight against urban renewal and erasure. This is a historic neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, once known as Brooklyn. So you can imagine that this is an American story. And you can imagine the amount of financial capital lost and even cultural capital lost from urban renewal and erasure in American cities all across the United States. We continue to fight against redlining and disinvestment. This is an image from Baltimore, Maryland. You can imagine that historic built environments like this impact the community's health and well-being. I want to read something from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition that said, for decades, low-income and minority communities were intentionally cut off from lending and investment through a system known as redlining. Today, those same neighborhoods suffer not only from reduced wealth and greater poverty, but from lower life expectancy and higher rates of chronic disease that are risk factors for COVID. We continue to fight against racial terrorism. We all remember this tragic moment when a white nationalist would assassinate and murder 9 church members inside of a sacred site of worship in Charleston, South Carolina. This is Mother Emanuel. We have provided $150,000 to help them to restore their historic church sanctuary. This is an example of how some Americans express their cultural values in public space. This building is on Nantucket, Massachusetts. It is the second oldest extant Black church building in the United States. We continue to fight against disrespect. We remember the summer of 2020 and the ongoing fight for social justice, but it seems appropriate that we continue to say his name, George Floyd. We're fighting against symbols of hate, symbols that have been weaponized to terrorize Black Americans in public space. I had the opportunity to write an op-ed for the art newspaper London, and I just want to read an excerpt from it. Pablo Picasso once said, "Art is the lie that enables us to realize the truth." Let the connection between public spaces and Confederate statues disappear, with ruins that will never be maintained again. These sites of conscience will remind nations never to forget the power of propaganda and racial politics cloaked with heritage and carried out with violence. Like an hourglass where each falling grain of sand is pulled to the bottom by larger forces. Let this community of false heroes enjoy their own decay, because the truth is that in the reality of this moment, Confederate monuments and their pride and prejudice are vanishing history. I wonder if there is an opportunity to develop a strategy for the future relocation, and I wouldn't necessarily say preservation, because I advocate that we shouldn't provide public investment in their maintenance and preservation, but to be able to leverage this history in this moment as an opportunity for national and global reconciliation. An unnamed protester would write these words on the side of the Decatur House here in Washington, D.C. The Decatur House is a National Trust historic site where African Americans were once held in bondage. And this protester wrote, "Why do we have to keep telling you Black Lives Matter? We continue to fight against systemic racism and seek opportunities for preservation to be part of the solution." So history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I want to talk about the work, preservation and social justice. As you heard in the introduction, I have the good fortune of leading the largest preservation campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places. It was created in the aftermath of the tragic events in Charlottesville in 2017. I use this image here because it's this moment where white men wearing khaki pants and polo shirts with tiki torches would rally around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of UVA, colliding heritage and public space and history in their advocacy for a modern form of Jim Crow. We at the National Trust knew that this did not represent our national values. It was one of these moments where preservation was part of a national discourse, which is often, it's fairly rare. And we wanted to seize the moment. We wanted to leverage this work to confront the miseducation of Americans. We wanted to begin the process of expanding the American story. And we wanted to leverage the work to foster truth and healing. Thus, a $25 million campaign was born to begin the work of building a true national identity. We consider ourselves a social movement that we are about making room within our own understanding of history, preservation, and social justice. We are a platform for creating positive social change. And we aspire to leverage historic places to redefine a new American narrative and culture. The first thing that we wanted to do was to build a new form of community and partnership. And so we established a 20-member board called our National Advisory Council that is co-chaired by Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, and actor and director, Ms. Felicia Rashad. We have an esteemed community of thought leaders that are proactively advising and supporting this work. To preserve history, it takes money. And in just 3 years, we've raised $25 million to be able to support 150 preservation projects nationally. And these are some of our partners. We are strategically engaging with national media as a way to build a national ethic for the preservation and even celebration of the Black experience in America. And I'm proud of these numbers that we have secured and earned more than 10 billion media impressions in 3 years, and are partnering with publications that until now have started to write stories about preserving African historic places. So reimagining preservation practice. You all know of James Madison's Montpelier. It is the home of a president known as the father of the Constitution. If you haven't toured the permanent exhibition titled A Mere Distinction of Color, I encourage you to do so. It's in the basement of this grand home, and it tells the story of the enslaved workers on this plantation. But the beauty is it doesn't just tell a story isolated in time, but it provides a through line all the way to contemporary life and highlights the legacies of slavery on Black America. Our work today is working with the descendant community who is organized after 2 decades to create a nonprofit organization, and we are exploring a shared governance and authority model that would allow the descendant community as well as the foundation to direct the interpretation, programming, and stewardship of this site. And if it's successful, I believe that it will be a national model for other traditional sites. Another National Trust historic site is the home of President Woodrow Wilson here in DC. He's known for his impactful international policies, as well as desegregating the federal government. So we wanted to reimagine an interpretation inside of a traditional historic site. And we partnered with artists that you see here on the screen. They worked with youth at the Wellington High School, and they composed a new composition that highlighted the DC counter-protest movement of the 1960s. And it was performed inside of his house on his piano in front of a diverse audience never before seen inside of this space. And we want to continue to build on that kind of reimagining and moving forward equitable interpretation. I'm sure you've heard of Shockoe Bottom that's in Richmond, Virginia. This is a case study in how do you make visible history that is presently invisible. If you walk Shockoe Bottom right now, you see nothing more than concrete and parking lots and an urban environment, but it is this massive archaeological site and burial ground, and an archaeological site related to the, I'm forgetting the name of Lumpkin's slave jail. So our work was advocating against the mixed-use $80 million inappropriate development project, and we organized a community and were able to successfully defeat that. And then we wanted to help the community to articulate their vision that linked together memorialization, economic development, and education through design. And this is what they want to see happen. And I'm glad to say that Mayor LeVar Stoney is supportive, and that some aspect of this, I believe, will actually happen in reality. So preservation is equity. The central pillar of our work is our national grant program. And these statistics really highlight that African American historic places continue to be underfunded and undervalued. So in just 3 years, we've received almost 2,500 proposals requesting almost $250 million. Thus far, we've invested $4.3 million in 65 preservation projects, and will invest at minimum an additional $1.6 million in July. But we've been able to support organizations and projects like this in Philadelphia. This organization has been all volunteer for more than 3 decades. They see themselves as a cultural anchor in West Philadelphia, a safe space for youth and the community. And our funding is helping them to hire their very first executive director in a paid position. You've heard of John and Alice Coltrane. Inside of this house, John spent a week isolated in a second floor bedroom, and he would compose A Love Supreme. Years later, Alice would record her first 5 albums in their basement studio. Our work here is about equitable interpretation. It's honoring the contributions of John, but it's elevating the contributions of Alice Coltrane in American jazz, but also telling stories of Black romantic life. And the fact that this is a home site where they raise their children, so it's more than just a place to tell a story about art and creativity. I'm sure you've heard of the playwright August Wilson. This was his former home in Pittsburgh in the Hill District. You probably have seen the movie Fences or Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which were both based on August Wilson plays. This is a prime case study that many African American historic sites have spatial limitations, so you have to leverage the landscape, the streetscape, the urban built environments as a way to program and as a strategy for engaging the community. And I'm glad to say that we funded an arts fellow that developed this play and brought the community together around this history. So if you travel to the south side of Chicago, there are so many amazing landmarks. There's the home of Muddy Waters, there's the Southside Community Arts Center, there's Quinn Chapel. You could go on and on about the richness that exists there. But I wanted to highlight the Forum. And so many legends of Chicago's arts renaissance performed in this building. This is a current tax credit project that has a cooperative strategy with Black ownership. And they are creating this cooperative approach where local citizens can invest in the rehabilitation and in this social impact project. It really is an anchor for stimulating revitalization on the South Side. I also wanted to highlight this project in Los Angeles, the Whiffendale Ladies Club, because I think there are so few examples that tell the story of the Black middle class experience during the period of segregation and Jim Crow. 50 Black women pooled together their money and resources. They would buy this elegant 2-story estate, and they would create their own safe space and social club known as Whiffendale. Today, the challenge is that the organization is aging in place, that the racial and cultural demographics of the neighborhood has shifted, And so they are looking to reimagine themselves as an organization, reimagine the audiences that they serve, and to find a new cultural identity within this kind of shifting historic built environment. Then there's the Jefferson School that is in Charlottesville. We provided a grant this past summer for their Mapping Seville project. And it's part of an ongoing project in visual analysis examining racial discrimination in the African-American built environment. Mapping Seville will research and teach the rich history of Black communities in Charlottesville and Central Virginia from the 18th century to the present. I hope you all can get connected to this project. Then there are historic neighborhoods like Treme in New Orleans that's designated not for its architectural significance, but for its cultural significance. When we learned that property owners were being fined for code violations for not maintaining their houses to a certain standard because it sits in a historic district, we thought that that was an injustice. So we have funded the Preservation Resources of New Orleans to pilot a new micro grant program that covers the cost of exterior renovations and that is engaging youth from the community through preservation trades. And we hope this becomes a national model for helping other similar communities. I hope some of you have heard about the remarkable life of activist and lawyer Pauli Murray. If not, there is an amazing documentary that's coming out in the next month or so, but this is her childhood home in North Carolina. Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as a Bible of civil rights law. She was the first African-American Episcopal saint. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dedicated her first briefing in the memory of Pauli Murray. We have just funded this organization to develop an interpretation plan and community engagement process that will really set the cultural themes when they open this place up next year as the Pauli Murray Center for Social Justice. Have you heard of Vernon AME Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma? Tulsa, Oklahoma this year is the 100th anniversary of the largest racial massacre in the United States that happened in the historic Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa. This building literally is one of the only last remnants that survived this devastation. We provided $150,000 to help them restore their historic stained glass windows. And in the process, they were able to leverage this to secure $750,000 for restoration. And they're working with one of the leading stained glass conservators in the United States. What's most important here is that we don't remember just the tragedy, that we also uplift this forgotten story that Greenwood was considered the Black Wall Street of America. It was once a thriving economic center and powerhouse, and we must tell that story as well. I wonder if you've heard of Robert's Temple. This is where Emmett Till's funeral was held. It was a catalytic moment in the American Civil Rights Movement when his mother, Mamie Till, made the decision to have an open casket funeral. It shook the soul and consciousness of America. Our work is to ensure that the activism of his mother, Mamie Till, that her contributions in the civil rights movement is remembered and interpreted and told. Not just the tragedy of Emmett Till's murder in Mississippi or the injustice that happened at the court hearing. We're working with a broad coalition locally and nationally exploring the potential of creating a national park, a contiguous boundary of a national park to tell this story. And then there's places like Claiborne Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. When the American Civil Rights Movement became more sophisticated, moving beyond political activism and advocating for economic justice. This is where Dr. King led 15,000 marchers as part of the sanitation workers' strike to City Hall. Inside of the basement is where the I'm a Man posters were designed and pressed. And we helped to establish a nonprofit that is leading the stewardship of this historic space. And they have a vision of using culture and the arts as a programming strategy to uplift the community. The last example that I want to highlight is in a little place called Tryon, North Carolina, population of 2,500 people. You probably remember a couple of years ago when 4 New York City-based visual artists, through their lens of arts activism and politics, they would create an LLC. They would purchase the house and save it from demolition. And then we created a partnership. So the National Trust is project managing and leading the preservation effort. Not only is it important to highlight simple, unadorned spaces that reflects much of the Black experience, to highlight places that aren't architecturally significant, but are culturally significant. But this project demonstrates how preservation can help to catalyze a new creative economy in rural environments and attract not only money and resources, but begin the long work of telling its true diversity story. So all of this work is about preserving American culture. Like the home of Madam C.J. Walker in Irvington, New York. This place stands to exemplify the perseverance and optimism of American entrepreneurship. Madam Walker was the first person in her family born free in 1867 on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana. She'd create a formula to help Black women's hair grow and be healthy, and would become America's first self-made female millionaire. She worked with architect Vertner Tandy, first licensed Black architect in the state of New York. In 1918, she would open the doors to this grand mansion at a cost of $250,000. She integrated the most expensive zip code at the time, strategically constructed this estate on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, considered the most significant Gothic architecture in America, and 3 miles from the Rockefeller estate, Kikett. I'm glad to say that we hold a preservation easement both on the exterior and partial interiors to ensure that this place retains exceptional integrity and perpetuity. The furnishings are not original, but the amount of integrity is just, it really is exceptional. From the chandelier to the coffered ceilings to all of those details. It is so rare because Madam Walker built this as an intentional monument in memoriam of herself and her life to inspire her race to reach its highest potential. This happened all before women had the right to vote. The last project that I want to highlight is one that is near and dear to my heart. And this is the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama. This is where the Birmingham campaign was planned and implemented in the spring of 1963. What we remember are the black and white images of the barking police dogs, of the violent white police officers, of the fire hoses in Kelly Ingram Park. What we have forgotten is the power of Black Birmingham and America to community organize, to develop a shared vision and sustain commitment to the implementation of that vision, to consolidate limited resources and to work collaboratively with allies to break the back of segregation across the South and to influence public policy at the local and national level. When I look at this date on May 10th, 1963, which was the truce to end the protest marches of that spring, it exemplifies for me how Black men, women, and children who were armed only with their truth in a spiritual battle against immorality, they tested and affirmed the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. Today, this motel that had sat vacant for 20 years is now the object and centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. So my last piece is really about leveraging preservation to create space. We created a fellowship program with intention to create space for Black thought leadership and ideas, even ideals. Brianna Rhodes is a freelance journalist who wrote stories on our Action Fund grantees. Candace Taylor's book, Overground Railroad. She is the leading cultural documentarian on Green Books. If you haven't read that book, Overground Railroad, it's awesome, a recommended read. And she is identifying Harlem Green Book sites eligible for listing in the National Register. Yoruba is producing a short doc on our work to preserve the Langston Hughes House in Harlem. Jenna Dublin is a co-author of our equity study that came out in October, getting her PhD at Columbia. And if you haven't read it, it's titled Preserving African American Places, a preservation as a path for creating equity. And it's a study of 10 cities from LA to New York. And it highlights the role of preservation and how it's contributed to issues such as cultural and racial displacement. It really is a progressive look at preservation. We also have our Hope Crew program that stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience, where we work with youth between the ages of 18 to 25. We introduce them to rich cultural heritage and preservation trades and paid positions. And this is an opportunity to cultivate the next generation of qualified conservationists that will be equipped to help take care of America's cultural assets. And then I don't know if you saw the news 2 weeks ago, but we just announced news through our new pilot program, the HBCU Cultural Heritage Stewardship Initiative, where we're partnering with 8 HBCUs, funding 2 campus-wide preservation plans and 6 individual building preservation plans. Through our partnership, we want to equip HBCUs with the knowledge and information to steward their cultural landscapes and their historic assets, help them to find ways to leverage their underutilized historic buildings. And I'm glad to say that through this work, we're also working at Tuskegee and Morgan State with their schools of design, where the students are learning preservation theory. They apply that practice back on a real world project through a preservation practicum. And this is our strategy for cultivating the next generation of Black professionals in this space. So as I am about to conclude my remarks, I wanted to include a quote from UVA's own Walter Hood. Black landscapes matter because they are prophetic. They tell the truth of the struggles and the victories of African Americans in North America. These landscapes are the prophecy of America. They tell us our future. I believe that it's time that we begin to create reverence and upliftment of Black culture and assets as American history. That we partner with real intention and purpose to reduce historical inequities. and that we leverage preservation through innovation to achieve quantifiable, equity-driven outcome. This is American history. Not just Black history. This is American history, and the ephemeral is how we conserve the living history and memory. So I want to leave you with this. The past and the present merge to meet us here. What future can we create together through historic preservation and design to create a more just and equitable society and to begin the hard work of building a true national identity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping that you might be willing to entertain questions from our audience, Brent.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
So please feel free to enter your question into the chat or to raise your hand in the reactions, and Beth Meyer and I will help deliver your questions.
Sheila, while we're waiting, I wanted to follow up with a question that I will apologize in advance by saying, maybe you talked about this, but I had some studio triage and I was a little late. So, but I'm really taken, I'm taken back, Brent. I think about my introduction to the trust when I was getting a master's in historic preservation at Cornell in 1978 to 80. And just how exciting what you're doing is and how different it is in terms of opening up the conversation about what matters. And I'm struck that the way you talk about sites and whose history they are, and the fact that there may be some questions about the integrity or the condition of a building that doesn't matter, or there may be some questions about sources having to be expanded using oral history as well as written history. And the trust is taking this on, but I'm still struck by the fact that the National Park Service hasn't done this in the same way that you all are doing that. And much of what we're stuck with in terms of preservation standards come out of the Department of Interior and the National Park Service. So I'm wondering, has the trust started to have conversations with the Park Service? Do you see some movement now, perhaps because of different administration, to start to open up preservation theory and practice that's funded by the federal government, which is where a lot of the incentives come through tax credits?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would just say that there's been an ongoing debate and conversation about how can we equalize architectural and cultural significance? Because for most diverse communities, whether it's Latino or Black communities, place really matters as much as integrity. Mm-hmm. And so Latinos in heritage conservation, Asian American Islanders in historic preservation, my colleagues at the National Trust are constantly debating and wanting to advocate for a reevaluation. I just wonder if that is a worthy goal, or if the existing guidelines and criteria have enough flexibility. And so sometimes I think it's really in the way that we're using that to make decisions. And I can give you this example. So when I was working at Hinchliffe Stadium, which is a Negro League ballpark in Paterson, New Jersey, it initially was listed in the National Register for being regionally significant. Today, it is the only National Historic Landmark in all of baseball. It is the only stadium that sits within a national park. Because of additional scholarship and the right kind of advocacy, we were able to take a regionally significant site to secure the highest designation in the country. So sometimes we have to work harder because the way that we review has been misguided. And so I would encourage us to begin the process of looking at what skill sets are needed at the evaluation process at the state and national level. How can we have more flexibility, especially as it relates to the evaluation of civil rights sites? So there is a current a civil rights heritage serial nomination for world designation. It initially only included 3 sites. It now includes 13. And the major issue is architectural integrity. So it's not just a US issue, it's a world issue in the way that we evaluate cultural heritage.
Thanks, Brent.
There's a question from Elisa Diamond, who says, great talk, thank you much. I'm wondering if you could go a little deeper on what mechanisms these projects are using toward economic and social equity. I've noticed in my own experience in preservation local history worlds, a few issues. First, that historically Black sites are often currently white owned. Preservation organizations and historical societies seem to be overwhelmingly white. And often imagery from Black history can get used to diversity wash new developments that actually benefit some of the same players who have been historically disadvantaged. How is the trust approaching these issues and others you may see that I haven't mentioned that are structural around power and historic sites?
So thank you for that exceptionally complicated question. So I'll just give you an example. I believe deeply that when I say preservation of social justice, it includes the social capital that you describe and the economic capital. And think back to when I talked about Claiborne Temple and the civil rights movement becoming more sophisticated because it leveraged both political activism, but also economic justice. That's the moment that we are in currently in preservation. The example is in Birmingham, Alabama, there is the Masonic Temple. It probably is Robert Taylor's most significant commercial building still standing in the United States. It has exceptional integrity. It's owned by the Masons, an African-American kind of fraternal organization. They have owned this property for decades, since the early 20th century. It's been vacant for decades. So our work is educating them on how they can partner with Black-owned social impact leaders and real estate developers that will structure a deal where the Masons are benefiting financially, but these developers have the knowledge to leverage the equity investments that exist, whether it's federal tax credits, new markets, opportunity zones. This is the work. It is about facilitating Black leadership across disciplines to help save these places and to ensure that the property owners, especially the Black property owners, are benefiting not only socially and culturally, but also financially.
Can I maybe follow up on that to say, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more, Brent, about how the kinds of work that you are engaged in, how that suggests our need to rethink the way we train people in cultural heritage, historic preservation work. You know, the lessons that you are implementing through the programs that you're doing, but sort of looking out over that landscape of of practice, it seems there are really important skills that are a part of this work.
I agree. And I think I've always felt a sense of responsibility to keep one foot in academia for this purpose. And even though the majority of preservation programs at the graduate level are mostly all white students, they have a deep value and commitment to social justice. So I want to ensure that they are equipped to work in diverse communities. And so often when I am giving presentations like this tonight, or thinking about what I want to teach inside the classroom, grounding in history and the inequity, like you have to understand how the past and the present intersect, which means that informs how communities, many African American communities, have significant distrust of power systems, of political systems, of outsiders. And that distrust is rooted in a structural racism. So I want to kind of ground that truth. I also help students to understand process, and that preservation takes time, it takes perseverance, and understanding that their role is to leverage their skills and expertise to help the community demonstrate its exceptional stewardship potential. That is really their role, not to be out front, not defining it, but to help them demonstrate that stewardship potential. And then for me, the third piece is grounding all of this work in business. I think we are often always strong at making a moral argument. You know, we no longer really have to kind of tie ourselves around trees and use the kind of old tactics of preservation advocacy, but at its core, preservation is real estate development. It is market-driven analysis. We have to understand the economic value of history and how that impacts short-term and long-term sustainability. So my dream is to see, potentially at UPenn or Maryland, having the first dual degree program with business and preservation, because I think that's where a lot of innovation will happen over the coming decades.
Brent, I've got a selfish question I want to ask. We've been really inspired getting to know Andrea Roberts, who participated in our Towards a Charlottesville Cultural Landscape Atlas a couple years ago. And she has shared with us a lot of the network mapping that she's doing with the Texas Freedom Colonies. And to me, there's a real power in her tool where multiple sites are understood in relationship to each other. And many of the sites you were talking about today, they have constellations of other sites, whether it was, the churches in relationship to green book houses where people stayed, or restaurants where they went. And I'm wondering if there's any other projects that are dealing like Andrea with these networks, because we're seeing the potential here in Charlottesville to start a project that connects everything from 18th and 19th century plantations to Civil War, city beautiful parks, to the national parks that were also segregated up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And Andrea's on our radar, and we've gotten to be colleagues with her. But is there any other group in the country we should be tapping into, or that you think are doing interesting multi-site work?
Yeah, so Andrea is awesome. I love her project. We invested $50,000 through the Action Fund last year to support her and her work. And she's filling a gap in the marketplace. It really is innovative and important work that she's leading. I would say similar, there is an effort to preserve Rosenwald schools and a lot of mapping has happened across the 15 states. They're also through Candace Taylor, who's the leading cultural documentarian on Green Book sites. She has documented almost 10,000 Green Book sites nationally and determined that only, I think, about 3% are still active businesses. And if I remember correctly, about 20% or so are still standing. There's some growing work out of the South to document slave dwellings and sites of enslavement. And that's partly with Joe McGill's Slave Dwelling Project and Joby, I forget her name, I think she mapped sites of enslavement in Virginia.
Yep.
Yeah, so when I think of kind of mapping, those are probably some of the projects that come to mind. What is clear to me is there's a need to have a national mapping and documentation project of the Black experience, because we are actively working in the 11th hour to eliminate preservation threats, organize, direct resources, and I want to move us away from being reactive to proactive in our approach for stewardship. And so understanding what exists, what's the condition, ideally layering this to understand the operational needs for sites that are open to the public. So I have this dream mapping project in my head, and I want to begin to bring together folks like Andrea and others to start working on it.
That's fantastic. That's great.
Will Malone has a question he'd like to ask you. Go ahead, Will.
Hi, Mr. Leggs. Thanks so much for coming to speak to us. It's great hearing from you and all this work that you all and at the trust are doing. I had a question about, so I'm from the historic downtown of Alexandria, Virginia, and I know from where I grew up and, in neighboring Washington, D.C., and also to some extent in Charlottesville neighborhoods too, that a lot of these neighborhoods have, or, historically Black neighborhoods have been experiencing gentrification for a long time, and some significant level of displacement has already happened. Have you all tried to work with neighborhoods where this has already sort of gotten going, rather than just, like, ideally, of course, you get it at the start, but do you find it harder to sort of rally the community around using preservation as this tactic to serve the community in places where displacement has already happened to some extent, as far as like community organization and everything?
Yeah, it's really hard to organize the community, because by the time the displacements happened, the community is fractured, the social relationships is starting to dissipate, and it's difficult to do that. And often, the power brokers that remain are connected to a historic church that's, oftentimes struggling to maintain their building and their role in the community. So in our equity study, I'm going to share this statistic, and I think it kind of affirms the direction that you're going, which is in the historically African-American neighborhoods that we studied. And again, it was 10 cities in this research project, but these historically African-American neighborhoods had lower home ownership rates than other neighborhoods in 9 of the 10 cities, with Louisville, Kentucky, and Atlanta, Georgia having the greatest disparities. Across the study cities with available permit data, historically African-American neighborhoods had about 35% more demolition per census tract and about 25% fewer building rehab projects per census tract than in other neighborhoods. That really represents that there is a continuum of the lack of investment to help revitalize African-American or even other African-American neighborhoods. What I have seen recently, and I am hopeful, is that places like Washington, D.C.'s U Street, it has experienced racial displacement, cultural displacement slightly, but the way they've marked space, they have used art and sculptures to be able to tell that story. They've used historic district designation to ensure that the remaining businesses of this economic Black community story are still standing, even if they're adaptively reused. The way that they have named the metro station in recognition of the Black history, although the racial makeup will change and newcomers will get to experience U Street, they have visual clues of the Black experience everywhere. And that is the balance. If there is going to be gentrification, then let's try to find ways through art to be able to limit the cultural displacement.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's a question from Danielle Wilkins, who says, connected to some of these socioeconomic issues you've mentioned, could you discuss any national trust strategies that have been successful for addressing demolition by neglect?
I think demolition by neglect, the only one that I can think of is the Excelsior Club in Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's a prominent Green Book site, and it was threatened with demolition. So I got a phone call from the local commission, and the moratorium on demolition because of economic hardship was about to expire. And I think it was a 1-year moratorium. We ended up listing the Excelsior Club on America's 11 most endangered historic places list. That is our national kind of annual advocacy tool, and it received a lot of public attention. That then caught the attention of a preservation-friendly developer out of California. And if it wasn't for this developer stepping up, and then other local philanthropic organizations like the Knight Foundation and others, that building likely would have been demolished. So the economic hardship argument should be hard to make when buildings are nationally significant. But property owners that are intent on demolishing buildings that aren't locally designated, or even if they are locally designated, if they have the right legal team behind them, it's likely that they can make that argument. So you have to be savvy in the tools you use to raise awareness, to publicly shame them, if have to be, and to organize the community in a sophisticated public relations campaign in order to save places.
Can I ask a question, Sheila?
Go ahead, Ellen.
So thanks very much. This has been terrific. So let me ask you a what if question. Let's say you get another $250 million or something. What's the agenda? What should we be working on? What would you like to see happen?
So if I get $250 million, then I want to quit my jobs and start the first Black-owned national practice and institution for this work, because I'm always thinking about infrastructure. What is the infrastructure needed to support a movement and to mitigate the kind of inequitable investment in this history and in Black communities? For me, the most important things would be, first, at the National Trust, I would endow the National Grant Program. And I would do that at $100 million. And to be able to have $5 million annually in perpetuity to invest in the preservation of these assets and back into Black communities would be transformational. I'd also like to take $50 million to invest in growing the operational capacity of these historic sites. The majority of historic sites are all volunteer organizations, and they have spent decades just getting the building restored and open to the public. and haven't been able to spend enough energy and resources on the management of that site. And so I would want to be able to provide that kind of infrastructure. I'd love to be able to work with like 100 artists. Artists are so creative in the way that they think about landscapes and history and space, and how they can actually still tell a story in the absence of traditional documentation and intervene within spaces, whether it's short-term or long-term. So to be able to work with artists to bring life to this history and some really creative programming. And then I would say the last piece for me is the real estate development. Like creating a whole training system of apprentices that want to be part of revitalizing their historic neighborhoods and communities. This for me is the Afrofuturist vision for American cities, and helping these social impact leaders understand putting together pro formas and deal making and securing the traditional capital for this kind of investment, I think would be transformational.
So that's fantastic. We just started a real estate development certificate here, and I have to say we've been trying to center, social values, environment, equity, and we've been doing some work on tax credits, but it's been much more about housing. So you could truly influence our curriculum greatly. We may have to talk to you really close and soon. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, Ellen.
Hey, Brent, there's a question from Sarah Bolivar, who's one of our alums who went on to the GSD to get a graduate degree. And it's related to maybe another part of the program you just mentioned. She says, thank you so much for your talk and all the Trust does to protect Black legacies. Building on Beth Meyer's comments, I wonder how students and professionals can be empowered and trained, much like citizen scientists, to support this mapping work. If we could create a cultural preservation app to photograph sites of note, much like plant and wildlife identification apps, perhaps citizen preservationists could amass more photo documentation and even inform historians of sites that would benefit from funding support. I'm going to do a little appendix to hers in that Naya Bates, who recently left Monticello to work on her PhD at Princeton, Naya talked about how some of the best preservationists in the United States are actually church communities that have filing cabinets where they've kept their local histories because they don't trust historical societies to do it. And I'm realizing there may be something between Sarah's proposal and Andrea Roberts that could fit into your $250 million.
Yeah, I forgot about the kind of the fifth pillar of my 250 million is mapping. And so I want to thank you, Sarah, for that question. So my one concern is quality control. Mm-hmm. And, to crowdsource, and unless you have what was described and how you can ensure accuracy, quality of information, or layer in the amount of time and energy, a strategy for evaluating the data to ensure quality control. But I couldn't imagine a mapping project not happening in some kind of crowdsourcing way. This is the perfect project to engage the public in this work, to introduce preservation and its meaning and contribution to the general public and to African American communities and others that would support this work, to begin to engage our youth. So I agree that with the kind of right integration of technology, learning from other disciplines, kind of the wisdom and lessons learned, and then bringing together some real smart folks that Beth has described and some players in the kind of GIS, Esri, Google technology folks, I think we could create some kind of app and documentation tool that could be really, really innovative.
like to follow up on your earlier reference to the project at Montpelier and have you think a little bit, talk a little bit more about that model of shared governance that they're working on and where that might fit into the kind of strategies you've been exploring and thinking about?
Yeah. So you can imagine that the staff at Montpelier, they, with intention, have been working for about 20 years to engage the descendant community. And their view of descendant community is those that have direct lineage to the enslaved workers there, but it's also the broader local and even regional Black community. And really the moment when they secured the money to reconstruct the slave cabins and to create the permanent exhibition and having that intentionality of engaging the descendant communities in shaping the interpretation strategy, felt like it was a test of how you work in a shared authority kind of strategy for programming and interpretation, and it was highly successful. We then funded through the Action Fund the development of the rubric on teaching slavery interpretation and descendant engagement. And we brought together 50 national museum professionals, preservationists, historians, and others. And this was this all volunteer collective that shared ideas and that would produce this publication that in many ways is a scorecard for traditional sites to evaluate their social justice kind of activities. And that is being seen as a national model. So then to have the descendant community formalized as a nonprofit and have the ambition of stewarding their ancestors' landscapes, stories, they feel that they have a right as much as any other person to this history, to this landscape, to this story. And as you can imagine, that work is complicated. The fragility around this topic is complicated. But it is the kind of work that must happen in this moment. And so it's my hope that in several months, that there will be a written document that highlights what the roles and responsibilities in a collaborative framework looks like, that we can test it in a pilot year, reevaluate and tweak what's not working, but with the value system that there is equitable representation from both communities in the stewardship of a presidential home. And if that happens, I mean, you can only imagine the implications for this all across the United States, not just in Black history, but how historic sites become true community partners.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one last question, if there are any lingering questions.
And I saw Kat's response, and I just want to give her a shout out because under her leadership at Montpelier, there was significant transformation. She is literally the walking example of innovation at historic sites.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you for your leadership. We couldn't have done it without you.
You're welcome.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this evening. I am very much looking forward to our follow-up with Brent, hoping that we can lure him back to Charlottesville when we can all be together in person again in the near future. So thank you so much for spending the late afternoon, early evening with us. And thanks everyone for coming.